In this general overview of the Oregon Residential Real Estate Purchase and Sale Agreement, Form 1.1, we're going to cover in broad strokes what this document does and how it operates. Now, we're going to start on the first page of the PDF. Whenever you print out one of the purchase and sale agreements through Oregon Realtors forms, you actually have the final agency acknowledgement as the first page. Why? Because the final agency acknowledgement is required in any of these transactions, and so we just automatically attached it to the front. This is technically Form 9.1 in the library. It's the final agency acknowledgement, just as Form 9.1 is a final agency acknowledgement. The only difference is it's attached to the front of the transaction. When you start your transaction, you should always disclose who all the buyer's agents are and who all the seller's agents are. This should be something that is acknowledged by both the buyer and the seller. They should know who the agents are in the transaction. Please note if you have a transaction coordinator or an assistant who is participating in the transaction and is licensed and is doing professional real estate activity under ORS 696-010-17, if they fall under the definition of professional real estate activity for what they're doing. They're helping negotiate the deal, or they're drafting documents and getting people to sign it, or they're helping facilitate property management, whatever it ends up being. That assistant or transaction coordinator is an agent in this categorization, and they should be included on the final agency acknowledgement. So the first page of the document, not actually the purchase and sale agreement, it's the final agency acknowledgement, and you should know how it works, and you should provide this every single time you start a transaction. Once we get into the actual purchase and sale agreement, this is page 2 of the PDF. It's technically page 1 of the PSA. This is how it begins with it's a three-part document. The first part of the document is the unique and specific terms to the transaction. In this section, the parties will input the various information that is unique and specialized to their transaction, such as the names of the parties should be unique, the property address should be unique, the buyer will have a distinct purchase price they wish to offer. You'll say whether it's escrow or client trust accounts, whether it's cash, if it's seller financing, if you're using non-liquid funds, you need to sell your stock account before you can purchase the property. You should specify that information. If there's a loan program of some sort that's being used, check that box. Essentially everything about this transaction that is unique for the buyer or the seller or the property, it should be on this first page and a quarter of the document. If you check a box in one of these sections with a bolded term, so for example, you check the box for FHA loan and you see bolded Form 2.19, that is in reference to the FHA/VA amendatory clause. So if you check this box, you need Form 2.19 as part of your offer or part of this transaction, because that form is required by federal law, and you should have that amendatory provision clause on this transaction. Similarly, if you're dealing with a seller carry transaction and you say, yes, we're doing a promissory note and deed of trust, you should have the seller carried addendum. If you have a different possession date, the closing is January 5th, the possession date is January 4th. Well, there's possession before closing, so you need a buyer pre-closing occupancy agreement in place. And so there are occupancy agreements. The bolded form such and such, 2.4.3, 4.1, whatever they are, these bolded form names are just indicating to you that you need that form as part of the transaction. This first page should generally tell you the information clients usually want to know. How much does it cost? How much is earnest money? How much do I put down? When do I close? Do I keep the fridge? That tends to be the broad strokes for buyers. The seller will want to know if it's cash or if it's a financed process. They'll probably want to know if the person is planning for them to terminate their tenants if they have them. But all of the broad information that the clients generally want to know will be in the first page and a quarter of the transaction. That is the first part of the purchase and sale agreement. The second part of the purchase and sale agreement is the time periods. If the client wants to know how many days do I have for XYZ, how many days do I have for the earnest money deposit, you have 3 days, or you can check the box and write in 9 business days if you want to put that in there. How many days do I have to provide my pre-approval letter? 2 business days, maybe it's more than that. How many days do I have to tell the party to do my due diligence? You can do it 10 business days. You could do more than that if you wanted to. You can set up the contingency, the timelines in this second part, all of the time frames. And the client wants to know how many days do I have to do the following things. It will be in the second part of the contract. How many days do I have to put in the smoke detectors? How many days do I have to renegotiate if there's a wildfire that destroys the yard? How many days do I have to provide the lead hazard documents? How many days do I have to provide the SPDS? And when should the buyer be able to revoke if they get the SPDS? It should all be provided in the second part. The third part of the contract is the general terms. They're not boilerplate. These are important terms to read and understand. But if you change these terms, you're probably practicing law unless you have a bar license. So if you change what closing means, you modify this term, you're definitely practicing law. If you want to just remove the ability to pursue a 1031 exchange, then you're probably practicing law. If you're modifying what representations a seller is making, if you're taking the FIRPTA provisions out, that is probably practice of law. And so in this third section, while it is important, it has all of the terms for how the parties are supposed to work with this transaction, how closing is supposed to work, how default operates, how termination works. It tells the parties how the contract is supposed to be interpreted. This third provision, this part of the contract, is important, but it shouldn't be changed. Changing it would likely be practice of law, and you don't want to practice law if you're not allowed to. So don't change any of the general terms. At the very, very end of the contract, on the last page, you'll have the ability for the buyer to put in when the offer expires at 6 p.m. or let's say it's January 6th at 5 p.m. or January 6th at 9 p.m. You can write in the expiration, the offer deadline. The buyer would then sign and date the document. And then the seller can check accept, reject, or counter. If they're countering, we have a form for that. If they're accepting an offer after the offer deadline has passed, after it's expired, it's only valid with the late acceptance addendum. So if you're going to be accepting this offer and it's past expiration, use the late acceptance addendum or counteroffer. In theory, a counteroffer is fine because it's a new offer. But if you're going to be accepting this offer as written, you need the late acceptance addendum. Lastly, the seller will sign and date if they're accepting. If they're rejecting, they technically don't need to sign and date the document. If they're countering, they also don't need to sign and date the document. They'll only be bound if they sign the document and check accepts, though. So if you do check reject and sign here, that's not a problem. You rejected it. Lastly, the agent will have the ability to show when this offer was delivered or presented. You can say on January 7th at 4 p.m., the agent presented the offer, and sign it. And that's your proof that you presented the offer. In broad strokes, what this means is as you move through the document from the first section with the broad and very malleable terms into the time frames where you do have input as a broker, you can choose the number of days, 3, maybe it's 7 business days for earnest money deposit. You have less and less input as you walk through the document. And the further you go, the more likely that changes to these provisions is practice of law that your license as a broker does not allow you to do. So as you work through the document, don't change these provisions. They must be in the contract. They're important provisions. Don't change them. In general, it's not advised to change these provisions, but make sure your client reads and understands each of the provisions in the contract. And at the very end, you'll be able to write when it expires and what the seller's response is.